Okay. So my topic is the Iran hostage crisis, and my theme was the United States and the Middle East. So I'm just going to go over what we'll be talking about today and the US and the Middle East relationship over the past 40 years, the Shah, the Ayatollah, President Carter, and then finally the Iran hostage crisis. So, for the US and the Middle East relationship over the past 40 years, I thought this could best be displayed with a video. And the video is going to be talking about the Islamic Revolution, the Iran Iraqi War, the Axis of Evil, nuclear deal, and Donald Trump.
The assassination of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani in a US airstrike has pushed both countries to the brink of war. But it's not the first time. Over the last 4 decades, several key moments have defined the tense relationship between the US and Iran. In 1979, a popular uprising overthrew the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was seen by many as an oppressive ruler, brought to power with the help of the CIA and supported by the US. When Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to lead the country under its new Islamic Revolution, he severed ties with the US, calling it the Great Satan. That same year, thousands of students, backed by armed revolutionaries, stormed the US Embassy in Tehran, holding more than 50 US diplomats hostage. Iran demanded the US hand over the ousted Shah so he could stand trial, but the US refused. Instead, it imposed a series of sanctions on Iran, which remained until 1981, when a deal was finally struck to release the diplomats. When war broke out between Iran and neighboring Iraq in 1981, the US stood behind Iraq's President Saddam Hussein, providing him with weapons and military intelligence. Leaked CIA documents would later show the US was aware that intel was being used to target Iranian troops with chemical weapons. The war would last 8 years and claim the lives of over 1.5 million people. In 1988, an Iranian passenger plane was shot down by the US Navy over the Strait of Hormuz, killing 290 people. The US said the aircraft was mistaken for a military jet and agreed to pay $61 million to the victims' families. US President Ronald Reagan later wrote a letter to Iran's government expressing his deep regret over the incident.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world by seeking weapons of mass destruction. These regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
During his State of the Union speech in 2002, US President George W. Bush named Iran alongside Iraq and North Korea as part of what he called the Axis of Evil, accusing the countries of funding terrorism worldwide and pursuing nuclear weapons. The hostility between both countries continued, with Iran's leaders accusing the US of trying to push for regime change. By 2010, the UN Security Council passed heavy US led sanctions against Iran, crippling its economy. After the election of President Hassan Rouhani in 2013, the two countries opened dialogue for the first time in 30 years. 2 years later, Iran, alongside the US and other world powers, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran Nuclear Deal. Under this agreement, Iran would limit its enriched uranium program, hand over most of its uranium stockpile, and allow international inspection of its nuclear facilities. In return, economic sanctions would be lifted. It was seen by many as a new chapter in US Iran relations and a victory for international diplomacy. But it wouldn't last.
The United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
In 2018, US President Donald Trump shocked the world by withdrawing from the nuclear deal, claiming it was flawed and gave Iran too much power. The move was rejected by the other 6 signatories, as well as by Iran, who maintained it would continue to abide by the agreement. That same year, Trump announced he was reimposing economic sanctions on Tehran, pushing tensions to their highest levels in years. After a US drone was shot down by Iran over its waters last year, the US prepared airstrikes in retaliation, only to be cancelled by Trump at the last minute. Following the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which the US says was to prevent attacks on its diplomats in the region, Iran has vowed to retaliate. It launched missiles at 2 US military bases in Iraq and announced it would no longer abide by restrictions on its nuclear program. Donald Trump responded by promising to impose even more sanctions. But as the two adversaries weigh up their military options, is diplomacy still on the table? Or will tensions finally lead the US and Iran to a point of no return?
Okay, so that was a history of their relationship over the past 40 years. And as you can tell, like, it's always been pretty shaky. Like, when you think of Iran and the US relationship, you think of 9/11 to be the main thing, but there actually have been like a lot of events that have caused tensions between us. So now we're going to do some background before we talk about the actual hostage crisis. And one thing that you need to know is who the Shah is. His name's Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. His people saw him as an oppressive ruler. He was officially overthrown in 1979. He was supported by the US and the CIA. There was an Islamic revolution where the Shah had to go to the US for an emergent surgery, and the Islamic Revolution arose because they wanted the Shah to return from the US to start trial. The next person is Ayatollah Khomeini. He returned from exile and led the Islamic revolution. He severed ties with the US, calling it the Great Satan, and he made an uprising of armed revolutionaries who supported the Islamic Revolution. Ayatollah revolutionaries, they were armed student protesters wanting the Shah to return to Islam from the US, and they captured 50 Americans from the US Embassy in Tehran. Thousands of students plus armed revolutionaries made up the Ayatollah revolutionaries. And like I said, sorry, I forgot what I was saying. They captured 50 American diplomats and held them hostage. President Carter. The Shah in emergency surgery, he didn't reason the surgery with political strategy in mind. Instead, his morals got the best of him, and he felt sorry for the Shah and allowed him to come to the US because they had the best medical supplies for the surgery that he needed. The US citizens did not like how President Carter could not get the hostages back. Many families were devastated, and the story was on the news almost every night. So every night, like, families would gather around the TV to see every hostage name. They would have a story about one hostage each night, and they would talk about like their families and everything. The hostage crisis affected the re-election of President Jimmy Carter, and since the people did not like how he handled the situation and it took so long to get the hostages back, this is not the main reason why Reagan won, but this was definitely a contributing factor. April 24th, 1980, he ordered a rescue mission in which 8 US military personnel were killed and no hostages were rescued. And now for the actual hostage crisis. November 4th, 1979, just after the Shah arrived in New York, a group of pro-Ayatollah students smashed the gates and scaled the walls of the American embassy in Tehran. They captured 66 hostages, but allowed 14 to leave because they were not American and not part of the cause. They kept the hostages for 444 days, which is longer than everyone, including the hostage keepers, expected. The hostages were officially released the night of the inauguration of Ronald Reagan.